Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. I'm Mega of Mayaani Jewellery, and this beautiful space invites us all to become more conscious about our jewelry choices, specifically our luxury jewelry choices, because luxury jewelry traditions have not really evolved, even though many of us have changed over the course of time in the way that we want to live our lives and the values we hold close to our hearts, and of course, with our world being more intercultural now than it ever has been, perhaps in the past, because of the ease of being able to travel across the planet, there are many reasons why we may wish to now start to examine luxury jewelry traditions and whether we want to actually preserve them as they are, or whether we want to moving forward actually shift a lot of the stories around these pieces of jewelry, a lot of the way in which the jewelry already looks or perhaps is made. Perhaps we want to shift who is behind the making process and designing process as well. So if you're with me this beautiful new video, I intend to speak with you and encourage you to think about heirloom pieces of jewelry in particular. So when it comes to heirloom pieces of jewelry, of course, there's a degree of power associated with them. Objects do hold power, and it's because not necessarily in a mystical, a magical sort of way, but very much because we give objects power. They do inevitably hold power. So that's fact number one. Objects like an heirloom piece of jewelry, for example, hold a degree of power. And that is because we have given them this power. So, for example, if we think about a wedding ring, we don't just think of it as a piece of metal. It is much more meaningful to us than that. It holds some sort of power over us, whether it's emotional power over us or whether it's actual physical power. In the case of a wedding ring, it's very emotional. And most objects, what I would think, and just thinking now about the objects I had in mind to share with you, I would think largely they have emotional control and power over us if we let them. So wedding rings being an example. Of course, national flags. Many people swear by them, live by them, die by them, owe allegiances to them, or swear allegiances to them. So that is just a piece of fabric, essentially. But it's no longer a piece of fabric when it's a national flag because we have given it power and meaning, deep meaning. Another example is family photographs. We do not tend to casually throw away or discard family photographs, even though the printed form, this is in particular, they're just paper and ink. We don't see them as just paper and ink. We see them as much more deeply meaningful than that. So heirlooms similarly hold some sort of power, some sort of value, whether it's in our lives, which is what we're going to discuss today, or whether it's in the lives of people in our family or the generations of our family. This is what we're here to particularly explore today. So, fact number one, that was an heirloom is not just an object. Expanding on that a bit before I move on to fact number two, it's not just an object, as we mentioned, it has power, but it also holds memories, identity, a sense of belonging. It can be a representation of a whole family lineage, depending on how long this heirloom piece has been within a family. It can hold a very deep, meaningful place within a family's history, but not necessarily in our own lives, because stories evolve over time. And as they evolve and shift and change, we do as well. And so here comes the question of whether heirlooms should similarly be allowed to breathe and shift and change. So the question is, when you have an heirloom piece, whatever that piece might be, when you have an heirloom piece in your life, by keeping it in your life and keeping it exactly the same as it is, untouched and unchanged, but potentially not meaningful to you in any way, not deeply connected to you, are we essentially preserving a relic here? Or are we going to move forward to make this a piece that's much more meaningful in our lives and therefore shift it away from being a relic and move it into being something that's much more meaningful? Um, so let's have a look at fact number two. Fact number two, honoring an heirloom piece can look very different to different people. For some people, honoring an heirloom piece looks like keeping the piece exactly the way it is, untouched, unchanged. But that is a beautiful act only if the intention behind that act is of pure, deep love and reverence for the person who this heirloom piece belonged to, or people, if it's been passed down along a couple of generations. who this piece belonged to, and a deep love and reverence for the stories that that heirloom represents. For other people, the best way to honor an heirloom piece is for them to meaningfully connect themselves with it, which may involve changing that heirloom piece to some degree, not leaving it untouched, but actually changing it. And by doing so, they may feel they're honoring this heirloom piece more because now it's deeply connected to them and they wear it or use it all the time. So it has become essentially alive. Rather than being an heirloom piece that's locked away in a box, perhaps they would never wear it, or because they do not feel a connection to it, it is now something, because they've changed it, that they are able to celebrate and enjoy and use and wear as often as they wish. And they're more likely to do that much more often than if it is something they do not connect with. Neither of these approaches is wrong, whether you choose to fall in the category with certain heirloom pieces of keeping it untouched and unchanged, or whether you fall in the category of wanting to change heirloom pieces and make them your own. Either approach is perfectly fine. I would argue the key is the intention behind the action, not so much the changing or leaving alone of the heirloom piece itself, it's the intention. So if an heirloom piece remains untouched and unchanged, but is loved and revered, and you feel a deep, meaningful connection to your lineage and your heritage, or the person who wore that particular piece or possessed that particular piece through keeping it the way it is, then that is a beautiful thing. However, if on the other hand, by leaving it untouched and unchanged, you essentially feel like you're preserving a relic, it's not something you can actually purposefully or meaningfully use in your life or wear or enjoy, it almost perhaps feels a bit more like a weight that you're dragging around. That I would encourage us to question whether it's actually worth, in that case, leaving that heirloom piece untouched and unchanged, or whether it might be much more honor, a more beautiful way to honor that piece, to actually transform it and change it so that it becomes more meaningfully connected to us. Fact number three: jewelry has always marked shifts in our belonging. I mentioned this a bit in my identity video as well, and video exploring how jewelry has different narratives across different cultures. Jewelry holds significance in our lives across different moments in our lives. We have specific pieces of jewelry we may receive because we are getting married, so they symbolize marriage. There are certain pieces we may receive because we're now mothers, so they symbolize motherhood. There may be pieces that symbolize independence, our gaining of independence, coming of age. There may be pieces that signify reinventing ourselves, or perhaps even pieces that signify the passing of a person. So jewelry marks shifts and changes in our story, in the story of our life. I would encourage us to one question here whether it is possible at all for the same piece of jewelry to do this if we open ourselves up to the idea of allowing these pieces of jewelry to transform as we transform and change. And essentially, you could end up with one incredibly powerful heirloom. If identity is constantly changing, our identity is constantly evolving and changing, then we have to question whether our adornment should also evolve as well. Because, of course, adornment is not just something we put on or wear or use to beautify ourselves. It actually has a very powerful and special place in communicating very unconsciously and perhaps not vocally what it is we stand for, where it is we come from. Our family lineage can be easily communicated through adornment, and I can think of certain types of beading style, for example, across the globe that belong to certain tribes, certain types of fabric that belong to certain groups of individuals. So your adornment is not just something you wear to beautify yourself, it communicates your identity. And if your identity is constantly fluid and evolving, we have to question whether our jewelry should stay stuck and fixed or equally evolve with it. And within that, an heirloom, I would argue an heirloom which is allowed to evolve and breathe, which people along the way are allowed to add their own stamp to or make their own, becomes more powerful. Think of it as a family quilt, for example. Each new person who inherits the quilt adds their own stamp or mark to it. Now, this piece no longer represents the story of just one person, the original person who started off the quilt, but it actually marks and represents the stories of all the people along the way who have added their chapters to the journey of this heirloom. So I would argue heirlooms are actually strengthened when we allow them to evolve, when we allow each new generation that inherits an heirloom to truly make it their own. And of course, there may be some along the way who want to keep it as it is, and because of that deep love and reverence, and they feel the connection, they don't need to change it to do that. But in some cases people may wish to, and we'll explore that a little bit more as we go through the facts. So the question here is, when you have an heirloom piece of jewelry or piece of anything in your life, furniture, clothing, whatever it may, bag, hat, when you have an heirloom piece in your life, I would encourage us to ask ourselves whether this piece feels like it fits into our life now. And if it doesn't, question whether by keeping it in our lives exactly as it is, untouched and unchanged, we are simply preserving a relic that essentially could lead to the end of a lineage, because heirlooms only hold that power provided we give them that power. And they hold that power if they're meaningful to us. If the meaning is no longer there, the power fades, and essentially the heirloom no longer holds the same legacy as it would if it were more deeply, meaningfully connected to us, and therefore the power continues to grow, if you like, or strengthen across generations. Fact number 4, preserving anything without some sort of meaning behind it loses legacy. I touched on that just now. I have touched on that fact already. But essentially, when you preserve something without any emotional attachment to it, it inevitably becomes an obligation. It's something you have to keep in your life because it was passed down to you. It may have only been passed down from, one generation to now you. It may have been passed down through several generations and now across to you. Either way, it's something you've been passed, you're being entrusted now to keep and to protect and to pass on. But if you're not permitted in any way to make it your own, and you have no emotional attachment to it, it can feel very much like an obligation. And of course, what happens with obligations? They become weights. They feel like a burden in our lives. As you move from home to home, country to country, you're dragging. It can feel like that, like you're dragging this piece along with you. You don't really have a place for it in your life. You don't really want it in your life, but you worry about what people might say if you got rid of it. And you also don't want to be that person who does get rid of it because, feelings of shame, for example, or guilt may come into the mix. But an heirloom piece should not have those feelings associated with it. An heirloom piece that's allowed to live and breathe, one that you do not have to seek permission to change or make your own, comes alive in a beautiful way. It starts to feel more empowering because you are allowed, you've had that freedom, that sense of freedom of, I have been passed this beautiful piece that carries all these stories and memories of all the people before me who have potentially molded it to make it their own. And now it's my turn. And what mark am I going to make on it? It can be very empowering, very liberating, very freeing. It can also be a beautiful way to continue a family legacy because, as I mentioned before, each individual along the way is now adding their chapter to the journey of this heirloom, making the story of this heirloom richer, deeper, more meaningful, and essentially expanding the stories behind this heirloom. So the heirloom is no longer stuck in one time frame and largely connected to one storyline, or the storyline of the original person the heirloom belonged to. It is now evolving to become meaningfully connected to a bunch of people in your family line, and a bunch of stories. So it's expanded in its meaning. It is more powerful, I feel. So here, I believe that your legacy, the legacy associated with an heirloom, becomes more powerful when you actually live and breathe it versus locking it away. And I'd encourage you to share your thoughts on this as well. Do you have, or have you an experience of an heirloom piece, either in your life or in the life of someone you know, which it seems from how they communicate about it or how you perhaps feel about it, if it's in your life, feels more like an obligation and something that you have to just preserve, and less like something that is actually meaningfully alive in your life? And would you want that to change? If you could have it change, would you have it change? Would you paint a different picture when it comes to heirlooms? And how would this influence how you pass on the heirloom when you pass it on? Would you be the one to grant that permission? Fact number 5, consciously evolving and reworking an heirloom piece is not an act of destruction. It can be a beautiful act of devotion. When you rework and change an heirloom piece that has not got an emotional connection to you, but you now make it one that does, you preserve majority of the materials because the materials have some power as well, because they're the way that you identify this heirloom. So you preserve as much of the heirloom material as you can. Of course, you're being very sustainable because rather than using new materials to create something completely new for yourself that does fit you, you are now reworking this heirloom to support it to be present in your life in a more powerful, meaningful way. You are also honoring the generations that have had this piece before you, because you are sharing this, you're continuing the legacy of this piece in a more meaningful way. Then you're going to go on to pass it on to someone in a more meaningful way, rather than just passing on as a meaningless sort of object that we just keep in the family because it's been in the family forever, so we have to keep it, we can't get rid of it. And essentially, you are now adding new memories to that piece by reworking it in a beautiful way, as we mentioned before, expanding it. Now, why is this quite important? In my personal experience, I thought I'd share a little bit of a personal story here. So, in my personal experience, when it comes to an heirloom, the one that comes to mind in particular was around my wedding time, my mum's wedding sari. So, my mum had a wedding sari. I cannot remember if it was for her formal reception, registry wedding, whether it was for her Indian Hindu ceremony, but it was her wedding sari, and she offered it to me. I was going to ask her if she would be open to the idea of me having her wedding sari for my wedding outfit, but not to keep it in exactly the same way. You see, that was the thing. I needed to rework it, and I'll explain why in a moment. For me, it needed to change. But my mum, the moment she discovered that I wanted to change it, she was not happy to pass it on to me. It was okay, you either wear it as it is, or you don't wear it. Now, why did I want to change it? My mum's marriage was not a happy marriage. She was in an arranged marriage, which, as far as I know, because I only know her side of the story, neither her or my father consented to. They essentially went on one date. It was agreed they'd go on one date, and that was it. So they went on one date. Let's see how it goes from here. They went on the one date. At the end of the one date, ended up at a relative's house, and it was their engagement party. And neither of them, yes, had the courage to say no, but neither of them said yes either. And this led to a very toxic relationship and toxic environment to grow up in. And I did not want to carry that emotional memory, which would be imprinted within her wedding sari. Because, as we mentioned, objects hold power, they have an emotional connection for us. So I did not want to carry those memories forward into my own marriage, but I wanted to honor my mum's memories of this being a beautiful gift that her parents had invested in for her. I believe, if I'm correct in my memory and remembering, her parents spent a fortune on this sari for her because it actually had real, genuine silver thread worked through it as well. So I wanted to honor my mum's memory, honor my mum through wearing her piece, but not keeping it exactly the same, because essentially I felt by transforming the piece for my wedding, and I am in a very healthy marriage, very healthy relationship. I essentially would be given the opportunity to transform that negative story attached to the sari and bring it to a new story, which is much more positive and filled with light and more of a positive, emotional tie or emotional story and narrative. So this is why this has come up, and why I'd love to know what your thoughts are when it comes to reworking and changing heirloom pieces. Should it be something that we are simply never allowed to do, or should we be encouraged to simply make it our own? If that means keeping it the way it is, we do. But if that means for us we need to change it for whatever reason, then we're given freedom and permission to do that. Of course, it's tricky when the heirloom piece belongs to someone who's still with us and is passing it on to you because they have expectations. But I would challenge those expectations. When that person is passing that heirloom piece to you, are they trying to preserve the material value of that heirloom piece or the meaning of that heirloom piece? So I welcome you to share your thoughts with me below. I'd love to know what you think. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video and found it insightful or would like to keep in touch with what I'm doing here, please hit the like button. Of course, you're welcome to subscribe. The notification bell is also useful if you wish to stay on top of my videos. I post one a week. And remember, as always, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. Thank you for joining me today. I'll be back again soon. And bye for now.